Alrighty, welcome back guys and gals to the Blue Room, where we break down two opponents, analyzing their strengths and their weaknesses to reach a conclusion on which fighter comes out victorious. And in this episode, we'll be covering Nate Diaz vs Jake Paul, which is scheduled to take place on August 5th, 2023 at the American Airlines Center in Dallas, Texas. Now, this is an ongoing series, so if you're a fan of boxing, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button to help a small channel grow. Now, let's just address the elephant in the room. With all the freak show fights shoved down our throats the past couple of years, let me just be clear, I don't think this is one of them, and neither does the boxing legend Andre Ward.
Nate, man, and the volume and having to like deal with the awkwardness and the height and the reach, and like that got me ready for Chad Dawson.
That's amazing.
Ward has trained with the Diaz brothers for many years and states that this will be a tougher fight for Jake Paul than the public realize. And I agree, because you see, Nate Diaz has trained with professional boxers his whole career. Now in MMA, sure, he's a Gracie Jiu-Jitsu wizard. However, his stand-up is primarily boxing, and against the best strikers in the game. He's shocked the MMA community time and time again. And despite how slow and unorthodox Nate Diaz appears at surface level, we're gonna break down why he's able to find success and how he can utilize this style against Jake Paul. Yes, Jake Paul. And I know some of you roll your eyes when I mention his name, but you gotta give him credit where it's due. He's proven through his actions that he has what it takes to be considered a professional boxer. After losing a controversial decision to Tommy Fury, however, previously on an undefeated run, defeating the likes of Anderson Silva, yes, an MMA fighter, but he had a boxing win over Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., who himself held the WBC middleweight title earlier in his career. So with that being said, before we go into the technicalities, let's first take a look at the tale of the tape. And let's begin with Nate Diaz. Fighting out of Stockton, California, he's yet to have a professional boxing fight. However, he does have an MMA record of 22 wins and 13 losses. And just to be clear, many of those losses were close fights to wrestlers. Nate is 6 foot in height. He has a reach of 76 inches. He's 38 years of age, and he fights out of a southpaw stance, which is something to keep note of. On the other side of the ring, we have Jake, the problem child, Paul, with a professional boxing record of 6 wins and 1 loss, which as mentioned earlier came in his last fight against Tommy Fury. Jake is 6'1" in height, although I do think that is questionable. He has a reach of 76 inches. We can assume he's still in his fighting prime at only 26 years of age, and he fights out of the orthodox stance. I think you guys would agree that the one thing that stands out here is that Nate Diaz is no spring chicken. Now, I wouldn't consider 38 years old an issue for the average man. However, Nate Diaz has been in the MMA game for a very long time. He's amassed a lot of scar tissue, and his previous 2 MMA fights, which we'll touch upon in a minute, suggest sadly that he's on the decline. Sad to say because I'm a Diaz fan, but it is what it is. Jake, on the other hand, is improving with every fight. He's fresh in the game, and he hasn't accumulated that much damage. However, to counter off that disadvantage, fighting out of a southpaw stance could prove to be an advantage for Nate. Jake's previous opponents were orthodox. This will be his first fight against a true southpaw. If we go back up to their record, Nate's lack of experience in the boxing ring, I believe, will play a factor with his cardio. A younger Nate was known for his great cardio. In MMA, this will be a 10-round fight, and although Nate Diaz is used to the limelight, I do think it's questionable how that MMA cardio translates to boxing. There's really not enough data to go off on that, so let's move on to both fighters' strengths and weaknesses. And let's start with Jake Paul's strengths. Now, he has had a few fights where he was seen as the hammer, and in fact, you can count his very first fight with YouTuber Deji. He has had to deal with adversity, and in all of those outings, he has shown heart, grit, and determination. I had him losing to Silva in the early rounds. In fact, it seemed like Silva was playing with his food, but Jake managed to turn it around, making it a highly competitive bout, dropping Silva in the later rounds. And when Silva understood the urgency of the situation, Jake continued to hold his ground, and I believe a lesser man would have wilted under those circumstances. In Jake's more recent fights, we've seen that he's able to cover distance relatively well. Against Tommy Fury, I actually think he showed improvements. He was utilizing his jabs more than usual, doubling it up, throwing more feints, at least in the early rounds, and surprisingly countering off of Fury's jabs. You have to consider as well that Tommy Fury has an 80-inch reach, and it was clear that this proved to be a challenge throughout for Jake. But all in all, I had him winning the fight, although I can pinpoint why this wasn't a clear-cut win for him, and that was because Tommy Fury didn't give room for openings. And finding openings is one of Jake Paul's key strengths, specifically when his opponents are reckless or lackadaisical, and his his rematch against Tyron Woodley was a perfect example of this, because just moments before Jake destroyed Woodley's legacy, sending him to the gulags, I had Woodley winning that fight. But in that small moment where Woodley remained stationary, Jake Paul capitalized with what many would say is his biggest strength, his knockout power. And these aren't TKOs. He leaves his opponents laying face first on the canvas, confused as to what just happened to them. And it's of course this strength and Jake Paul's ability to capitalize on a stationary target that does have me slightly concerned for Nate Diaz. However, since Jake is still new to the game, he carries with him some fundamental weaknesses. He has a plodding style. You'll often see he leaves his leg behind him because he's looking to throw the overhand right at full power, but that often makes him an easy target with the jab. He also has a habit when he's competing to land the jab. You can see he's overthinking, and with that he ends up remaining stationary. And the problem with that is, again, because he's still young in the game, he hasn't quite built up those reflexes to win those jab exchanges. I also think that cardio might be a factor for Jake. He didn't look too shabby in the Anderson Silva fight, but against Tommy Fury, he didn't quite have that pep to his step to push the pace when it was needed. Jake's not a small guy. He does carry a lot of muscle, specifically in his legs, which isn't often the norm in boxing. Of course, leg strength is vital in boxing, but I do think Jake could cut down a little bit in that regard. And I know I've mentioned that he's susceptible to the jab when competing to land it, but it has to be said he's even more susceptible in the later rounds when he's tired, because his defense is almost non-existent. And I understand it from a tactical standpoint. He's a durable guy. Keeping your hands down draws your opponent in, and with that we already know what Jake's biggest strength is. But we'll get on to keys to victories in a second. Let's evaluate Nate Diaz's strengths. How Nate boxes in MMA has its limitations, because he has to be aware of leg kicks, the takedown, etc. But with that being said, one thing that always stands out for me is Nate's timing. In his last, say, 5 or 6 performances, you can see his body structure's changed. He's still slim and slightly lanky, but his arms have packed on a bit of muscle, which in turn I believe have slowed down his jab somewhat. However, his timing makes up for that. And a fight that always comes to mind when we're talking speed versus timing is when he fought Michael Johnson, who is easily one of the fastest strikers in the game. Nate was able to keep Johnson on the back foot, landing the jab repeatedly, and that brings me on to Nate's second big strength, which is his 1-2 combination. I would say, if anything, it's his favorite combination to throw in most of his fights. And in my opinion, it's one of the best combinations in boxing, because you're keeping things down the middle, meaning there's less room for openings. It's the same combination that rocked Conor McGregor in their first fight, and the same 1-2 which left the current welterweight UFC champion Leon Edwards on Bambi legs. Leon Edwards, again, being another fighter who was faster than Nate Diaz, but he ended up getting caught. And if that fight was just another 20 seconds longer, it's very possible Nate would have got the stoppage, which leads me on to another underrated strength of Nate Diaz, his precision, which makes up for his lack of power, where when he connects on the dot, he can hurt you. And getting hurt in the earlier rounds with Nate Diaz is the last thing you need, because he also has great cardio. It's been hit and miss in the later years, specifically when he hasn't competed for a long time, but I do believe he's taking this fight seriously. And if Nate Diaz's cardio is on point, we saw against Leon Edwards, he thought he had the fight in the bag, but where he was exhausted from putting on the pressure, Nate Diaz remained durable. Nate's durability is through the roof. Often in times when he's getting knocked down, you assume the fight is over. He's been dominated, but he's able to maintain his composure, and like we saw with both Conor McGregor fights, his opponents wear themselves out. They think they have the fight in the bag, but then they have to deal with the relentless pressure of a fighter with great timing, precision, cardio, and durability, which is often why and how Nate Diaz pulls off the victory, but not all the time. The things that I would deem to be weaknesses, there is the perspective they could be strengths too. For one, he often appears to be off balance. When he throws combinations, it takes him half a second to reset, which leaves openings. But again, he's made this work for him. Whether he means it or not, psychologically, he's baiting his opponent in because they think he's a sitting duck. Nate is the older man going into this. He has a lot of wear and tear. As we saw in his Jorge Masvidal fight, it didn't take long for old cuts to open up, and there is the potential that, like that fight, there could be a doctor stoppage. So, how does Nate Diaz win this fight? Well, it might sound cliche, but I think Nate needs to make this an ugly fight. He's not the young sniper anymore that took out the likes of Takanori Gomi. He's slowed down. However, he is durable. And if Nate can keep up that constant pressure, sticking to the fundamentals of boxing that he's already found success with, the 1-2, he should be able to pull out the victory. We have to consider that this is Nate's first boxing match, and his fastest way to a loss is to start doing unorthodox, reactionary movements, which will leave him open to Jake's right cross. So he needs to remain defensively sound, if not with his hands up, then at least being aware of his distance at all times. The jab will be there for Nate in the later rounds, and I believe if he can keep Jake at bay with the jab, counter with the 1-2 straight, and then put the pressure on Jake, utilizing his durability, I believe Nate Diaz can get a decision win. As for keys to victory for Jake Paul, composure is going to be key. Jake Jake cannot underestimate Nate's ability to hurt him, and he must be prepared to go the full 10 rounds, meaning he has to pick his spots. There should be times where he's on the outside using lateral movement, mixing his jabs to the body, to the head, and then finding those moments to blitz and overpower Nate Diaz. And each time he doesn't find success or Nate appears to be too doable, he needs to reset. Continue to mix up his shots, because I think if he's competing with Nate to land a head jab, he's going to lose in most exchanges. Jake needs to mix up his offense, keep it light, and play the long game. Maintain his cardio so that in the later rounds, if he's winning on the scorecard, Nate will have to put on the pressure, which can give Jake those openings to connect with the overhand right hook. If Jake implements a strategy similar to this, he can win either a decision or a TKO in the later rounds. However, with that all being said, who do I think is going to win this fight? Well, this is a new chapter for Nate Diaz. I genuinely think he's motivated, and I envision an ugly fight to where Jake Paul might be surprised by Nate's strength. You have to remember he's been training wrestling defense most of his life, and I think Nate Diaz outworks Jake Paul to a decision victory. And I have a feeling you guys think I'm crazy for that prediction, so let me know in the comment section if you agree or how you think Jake Paul gets it done. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this technical breakdown. I release these videos once a week, so please do consider subscribing, and if you appreciate my efforts, be so kind as to leave a like, and I'll see you guys in the comment section. I'm hoping this is going to be a great fight, so have a great weekend, and may the best man win.